Okay, so we just covered, let me see, horsepower, indicated, right? Indicated horsepower. Make sure I said it right. Indicated horsepower. So I've indicated. Indicated is purely
Power produced without friction.
theoretical. Correct. It's mathematical. It's, right? So it's not real. It's like what we wish. All right. Then we have, so that was indicated horsepower. Then we have brake horsepower. It's how many horsepower it takes to brake the engine. That is actual horsepower delivered to, I wrote delivered to engine, but that doesn't make sense. We'll say delivered to output, the output shaft, which should be, well, I haven't covered that yet, but since I wrote it, indicated horsepower, which was theoretical, mathematical, minus brake horsepower, would equal friction horsepower, which I haven't covered friction horsepower, but since I wrote it, I think I better put it now or forget, which is another way of saying we take this purely theoretical, what the engine should be doing, then we figure out what the actual brake horsepower is delivered at the output shaft, and the difference between the two, well, where's the difference? Well, that's the friction that happens in the engine. So what is brake horsepower, which is really where I need to go back there? It is something that's actually measured. So how do they measure it? Well, they use a thing called a Prony brake. So it is a torque or twisting force. Or twisting force. We'll do this. So torque. That just didn't work out well. T-O-R-Q. Well, I'm thinking about something else. So here's what I was thinking about. So what I wanted to do, and this is going years back, I thought, okay, so you look at like cars and stuff, and they'll say, well, it's, X number of horsepower, but this many foot-pounds of torque. I go, okay, explain to me the real difference between horsepower and torque. And I have searched high and low. I've read articles. I've watched videos. And nobody can really explain it and distill it down to like, this is this, this is that. And they all kind of just come up with this mushy little, I don't know if anybody, you guys have any idea? Because there really isn't, to me, a clear definition of why one is one and one is another. How can you get more horsepower and this one has more torque, but this one has a little less horsepower but more torque? It doesn't make sense. I just kind of go, don't worry about it. It's not something they ask you about. So, but anyway, torque is force times distance. At right angles to the force, expressed as pound inches. Notice it's backwards. Or pound feet. Not feet pounds, pound feet. So as where work is expressed as inch pounds, I'll remember that. Remember work is expressed as inch pounds or foot pounds. So work is done that way, and work is how we get horsepower. And torque, we do it the opposite. It's pound inches or pound feet. What does it mean? I don't know. So how do you measure this stuff? Well, we can measure it using the dynamometer. Or, as I said, a torque meter, often called a Prony brake. Which is a Prony, not a pony. I'm not slurring. Prony brake. And I've looked up Prony brakes. In fact, we had one here. I found one. I was digging around, and I'm like, dude, this is a Prony brake. It's really cool. And so the pictures and the thing I found is a very small one. But basically, it's like you imagine the engine with a drum on it. And the drum is polished. And you take a belt, you put it on that belt, and that belt goes up to another like pulley that is attached to a, I thought I had a picture, attached to an arm that's like on a scale, right? And so the more you twist the top one, the more it's going to push this arm on the scale, give you a reading. And so what you do is you tighten this belt, and that belt then puts friction and going. But I'm thinking, well, that's all fine and well, but the minute you do that to the point where your RPM drops a little bit, you've just lost horsepower. So you can only do it to the point where you start to lose horsepower, back off. Anyway, they didn't ask me, so just thinking things through. I'm like, okay. So what's the takeaway as I kind of mumble about all this stuff? Brake horsepower. We have indicated horsepower, which is theoretical, and brake horsepower, which is something that is actually measured using equipment at the output shaft of the engine. It's a true measurement. And which one should be higher? Indicated. Because you have indicated what it should do, you have the output, what it gets you, and what is missing is called friction horsepower. Okay, so which is my last thing, friction horsepower. And that is indicated horsepower minus brake horsepower equals friction horsepower. And it is about 10 to 15% of the horsepower lost. So if we were talking about cars, we would be done. But we're talking about airplanes, so we're not done. So now we could talk about thrust horsepower. And that is when you combine your propeller and your engine together. See, in a car, we're just going to go to drive wheels, which just push the car along. Wheel goes around once, it goes X number of feet. That's just, unless you're spinning, that's the way it's going to work. But with the propeller, we have, it's obviously not a direct contact. Well, it's direct contact with the air, but you have slippage, is the point I was going to make. So thrust horsepower is when you consider the engine and propeller combination. So that would be brake horsepower times propeller efficiency. So if I said I had 100 brake horsepower out of my engine, but my prop efficiency was only 75%, and we'll talk a lot about prop efficiency when we get to props. Don't want to ruin it for then, but props are not 100% efficient. In other words, they've got a certain angle on the blade, and if you theoretically figured the angle on that blade, how far would the airplane travel in one revolution because of that angle, and then you figure, yeah, but it didn't go this far and went that far. That's slippage. It slipped in the wind and in the air, and so it only moved forward, say 75%, then it's 75% efficient. So you take brake horsepower. So if we had a 100 horsepower engine that had only a 75% prop efficiency, the thrust horsepower would then be 75%. So, and because props are never 100% efficient, you're always going to lose some of your horsepower. Not 100% efficient. Some thrust horsepower. Actually, I wrote brake. That would make sense. Some brake horsepower, BHP, is lost. All right, what's takeaway of all that mess? Or the so what, if you will. So if any of the following are increased, horsepower is increased. All right, so I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 things. What was the first thing? Increase this, we increase horsepower.
Pressure.
Pressure. IMEP, indicated mean effective pressure. So we see higher, so we get higher compression ratio. Well, why don't we just keep going more and more higher? Well, as there's going to be limited by, limited by engine design. You keep boosting it, eventually you're going to bust the top of the head. So limited by engine design, limited by fuel design. Let's see. What else can we do to get that pressure up?
Turbo.
Yep, that's my third point.
Mm.
How about volumetric efficiency? How can we increase the volumetric efficiency? Ram air,
Intake, exhaust design.
intake designs, exhaust designs. Did you say bigger valves? Bigger intake valves.
Cam profile.
Cam profiles, which is to say how long the valves are open, how they open, because we could slam them open and slam them closed. We could gently open them and gently close the valves. We can leave them open longer. We can close them sooner here, change the duration. We can do all kinds of stuff. So cam design is a good one. I'll just put that cam design. Cam design, intake design, valve size, more intake valves. Oh, we don't do that in aviation. And I already heard this one, turbo. And we'll talk a lot more about turbo next class. Let's see. Pressure, turbo. B. We could increase engine displacement. Well, that's increase the bore or stroke. Again, that's a whole different animal there. Increase RPM. How do you increase RPM in an aircraft engine?
Throttle to the firewall.
Actually, we're already running them wide open throttle.
Point the nose down.
Point the nose down.
Fly higher.
He's not wrong. Try harder.
Fly higher. Higher.
Yeah, you have to repitch the prop to get more RPM. Or if you have a constant speed prop, it's a little tiny screw that you can get to without even doing anything. You just kind of screw that screw out, and our governor's going to let you go much faster. Increase RPM, so that is limited by propeller tip speed. Prop tip speed. What happens if the props, because you have to remember that a propeller is going around in circles, just like a wheel, a tire. The middle part doesn't spin all that fast. It's faster. It's same RPM, but miles per hour, the tips are going a lot stinking faster. And once they get transonic, like I said, you can lose an engine. And by lose an engine, I mean literally like the engine fell off, kind of lose an engine. Because what happens is you set up these harmonic vibrations that will cause the pieces of the propeller to come apart. When the prop becomes, part of the prop leaves, then it'll shake the engine so bad that it'll actually pull it out of its mount. So when it does that, then it just falls off. And then when it falls off, your center of gravity gets all whacked out of your airplane and you back up to the earth.
Very gently.
There's nothing to do about that.
It's a
Limited,
balance problem.
it is. Limited by prop tip speed and efficiency, or we could increase number of cylinders. Well, that's pretty much what Lycoming does with their their engines. I want to say the 360 is the exact same thing as the 540, except the 360 has 4 cylinders and the 540 has 6. They added 2 more cylinders and went from a 360 to a 540.
Change the T-stroke?
Yes, or more power pulses per minute. However you want to do that. 2-stroke, you got it. All right. Tell me when you're good. Good? Okay.
Good.
All right. Last little bit here, which is just kind of reviewing what we talked about. So, IMEP is indicated. There's not a. I hate it when they call it indicated. Well, is there like a dial or a gauge? No. Indicated mean effective pressure. Pressure. Which is what?
PSI.
Average pressure during power stroke. We talked about the BMEP, which is the brake mean effective pressure. Actually, I'm sorry. I wrote here, if time permits, and I just realized that we're now going into a whole other thing. We don't need to do that. Yeah, these are effective pressures. Nope, we don't need to go into that. We're good. IMEP, we reviewed that. Excellent. I'm not going to throw this out at you because it just becomes more numbers and confusing, and it's not important. Unless you want to know about it, come see me. Questions?